The world once walked through an age where faith and fear shared the same throne. Between the stone walls of medieval Europe, humanity discovered a darkness so profound it blurred the line between justice and cruelty. Kings ruled by divine right. The church declared itself the guardian of souls, and beneath both powers, the human body became a battlefield, a canvas of pain and punishment. Torture was not merely an act, it was a system, a method to extract obedience, silence rebellion, and manufacture confession. In those shadowed centuries, pain became the currency of truth. The medieval world believed in the purity of suffering. To the church, pain was cleansing, a divine fire that burned away sin. To monarchs, it was control, a visible symbol of power over flesh and will. In dungeons beneath cathedrals and castles, men and women were not punished merely for crimes. They were corrected, purified, remade. Those who defied doctrine were declared heretics. Those who challenged the throne were branded traitors. And for both, the price was the same, an invitation into the world of devices forged not for death, but for agony. Steel, rope, and iron were molded into instruments that mirrored the darkest corners of imagination. Devices that turned the human body into a spectacle of torment. Each twist, each tear, a deliberate design to stretch the limits of endurance. Yet these devices were not born from madness. They were born from belief. Every spike and screw was justified by scripture, by law, by duty to God or king. The torturer was not a monster, he was a servant of order, a craftsman of confession, a priest of pain. The story of medieval torture is not the story of brutality alone. It is the story of civilization's descent into a moral paradox, how intelligence, faith, and authority combined to create machines of suffering in the name of righteousness. From the catacombs of the Inquisition to the chambers of royal executioners, these devices reveal something deeper about humanity itself, not just how people inflicted pain, but how they understood justice, sin, and fear. Torture, in its most sinister form, was theater. Public executions became grand performances, where crowds gathered not just to witness death, but to feel the weight of control. When a traitor's body broke, an empire's authority was affirmed. When a witch confessed through screams, the church's power over the unseen world seemed absolute. Pain, thus, became a language, a translation of faith and fear into flesh. But to understand how this world existed, one must first understand its logic. The medieval mind did not separate the body from the soul. To harm the body was to heal the spirit. To extract truth through pain was to serve divine justice. Every device carried this philosophy within its iron teeth. The rack stretched the body until bone and belief both cracked. The Iron Maiden promised salvation within its steel embrace. The Judas cradle, the breaking wheel, the pair of anguish all served the same purpose, to turn faith into terror. As centuries passed, these instruments evolved, becoming more refined, more efficient, more symbolic. Behind every tool of torture lay a craftsman, a theology, a system of law. Torture was bureaucratic. It was recorded, regulated, and justified. Even the architecture of castles and prisons adapted chambers designed for echoing screams, for isolation, for breaking minds before bodies. The dungeon became a sacred space where law met horror. But torture was never about truth alone. It was about fear. When people whispered about what happened in the castle basements or behind monastery doors, obedience followed. The myth of torture was as powerful as torture itself. A ruler needed only to hint at the rack, and loyalty was restored. This was the secret machinery of control that defined an era. For the inquisitors of the church, torture was divine interrogation. For monarchs, it was political enforcement. For the people, it was spectacle, a grim entertainment that reinforced their place in the cosmic order. And in this balance of faith and power, humanity's conscience twisted into something unrecognizable. The Dark Ages were not just dark because of ignorance or disease. They were dark because they illuminated the most frightening truth of all. That cruelty, when wrapped in the language of virtue, becomes civilization's most dangerous invention. This is the truth history tried to bury under layers of legend and morality. The truth of how human beings, guided by scripture and authority, engineered suffering into art. As we open the pages of this forgotten world, we step into the silent chambers where time still holds its breath, where rusted chains hang like ghosts, and the stone remembers every cry that once echoed through it. These were not acts of chaos, they were rituals of order. Each device tells a story of power, of who controlled it, who suffered beneath it, and why it was believed to be just. To uncover the secrets of ancient torture devices is to confront the shadow of civilization itself, to ask how far humanity will go in the name of truth, justice, and faith. The deeper we look, the more we realize the Dark Ages were not a period of madness. They were a reflection of belief, belief so powerful it turned cruelty into righteousness. And now, as the iron doors creak open once more, we descend into the chambers of history's most chilling creations, each forged in the fire of human conviction, each whispering the same question that still haunts us. How can the pursuit of truth lead to so much pain? The birth of torture, faith, fear, and the Inquisition, the beginning of torture, was not marked by the invention of a single device or the decree of a single ruler. It began with an idea, a belief that pain could reveal truth. In the medieval world, faith was not simply religion. It was law, reason, and morality combined. The Church was the supreme authority, its influence extending from kings to peasants, from the battlefield to the bedchamber. And with this divine authority came the responsibility or the justification to correct the souls of those who strayed from God's path. The heretic was the enemy of order. He did not need to wield a sword or start a rebellion. A whisper, a doubt, a refusal to confess, these were enough to challenge the Church's foundation. For if one man's disbelief could exist, then the truth proclaimed by priests could be questioned. And so, to silence that question, the Church turned to the body. In the 12th and 13th centuries, Europe was an uneasy landscape of power and fear. Kingdoms rose and fell like shifting tides. The Crusades raged in the East, and within Europe itself, faith splintered. The Cathars in France, the Waldensians in Italy, the Templars in their secretive halls, all were seen as threats to the purity of Christendom. The Church responded with a weapon that was neither sword nor flame but doctrine, the Inquisition. When Pope Innocent III authorized the Inquisition in 1231, it was described as a process of salvation. But beneath the language of faith lay something far darker. The Inquisition was designed to root out heresy by any means necessary, and in the eyes of the Church, confession was not optional. Confession meant redemption, and redemption justified suffering. The logic was flawless, terrifyingly so. If a soul could be saved through pain, then inflicting that pain was an act of mercy. In the damp stone chambers of monasteries and cathedrals, inquisitors began to apply this doctrine. Men of learning, trained in Scripture, now turned their intellect toward methods of persuasion. They believed truth resided in every soul, but sometimes it had to be forced out. At first, torture was subtle: sleep deprivation, starvation, isolation. But as heresy spread and resistance hardened, so too did the tools of faith. Chains became standard, ropes grew thicker. The architecture of punishment evolved into a science. Every device that followed, every wheel, rack, or press, would draw its moral legitimacy from this moment in history. The Inquisition was the crucible that transformed pain into proof. The accused would be brought before a tribunal, their crimes listed in a language they often could not read. They were told that silence was guilt, and denial was proof of deception. The only path to freedom was confession, and confession came through agony. A man could withstand hunger, thirst, even imprisonment, but not the instruments that awaited him below. The Church believed these methods were precise, divinely guided. The Inquisitor's role was not cruelty, but correction. If the subject confessed, the soul was cleansed. If he did not, the body was condemned. Among the earliest recorded methods was the strapado. The victim's hands were tied behind his back, a rope looped over a pulley. As he was lifted, his shoulders tore from their sockets, his body suspended by pain alone. If mercy was shown, the rope was dropped suddenly, snapping bones, dislocating joints, and leaving the accused half conscious, half broken. It was said that the strapado left no blood, no visible wounds. It was the ideal Christian torture, spiritual in its cruelty, clean in its execution. But as the decades passed, and heresy refused to vanish, inquisitors became more inventive. Each new rebellion brought a new method, and each confession recorded justified the next device. By the 14th century, the rack became the symbol of confession. Two wooden rollers connected by a crank. The victim's wrists were tied to one end, his ankles to the other. Each turn of the handle pulled the body apart, stretching muscle, tendon, and bone beyond their limits. The sound of cracking joints echoed in the stone chambers, a symphony of obedience. For the inquisitors, this was not murder, it was revelation. They believed pain peeled away lies like flesh from bone, revealing the truth beneath. Records show that some inquisitors prayed before using the rack, asking for divine guidance. They considered themselves surgeons of the soul, cutting away sin with the tools of agony. In Spain, France, and Italy, inquisitorial torture was codified into law. It was not random brutality, it was structured, documented, and justified by papal decree. A confession obtained under torture was admissible in court, but only if the victim confirmed it afterward. A cruel irony, since those who refused were simply tortured again. The Church maintained an image of purity throughout this process. Executioners were often laymen, hired to perform the physical work, while inquisitors remained cloaked in theological distance. They did not touch the condemned, they simply ordered what was necessary for salvation. For the common people, the Inquisition created an atmosphere of absolute fear. Heresy became an invisible crime. Anyone could be accused, a neighbor, a friend, even a priest. And once the accusation was spoken, there was no defense. The process of torture was ritualistic. The prisoner was stripped of dignity, bound, and presented before the device. A scribe recorded every word, every scream. The inquisitor asked questions in a calm, almost gentle tone, as if he were guiding the victim toward truth. It was his contrast to serenity of faith and the violence of action that made inquisitorial torture so chilling. It was not chaos, it was order. Every act of pain was justified, every cry sanctified by divine authority. By the time the flames of the Inquisition began to wane in the late 15th century, thousands had been broken in its name. The Church had proven that torture could exist, not in defiance of morality, but in service of it. This was perhaps its greatest legacy and its darkest. The philosophy of the Inquisition did not end with the Church. It spread subtly and silently into royal courts, legal systems, and the very structure of governance. The idea that truth could be extracted through pain became a universal principle, one that would survive far beyond the Dark Ages. And as the Inquisition's fires dimmed, another era began to rise, an age of kings, empires, and politics. The tools of torture would no longer serve God alone. They would now serve power itself. When the echo of the Inquisition began to fade, Europe found itself in a strange transition. Faith still ruled, but it no longer stood alone. Kings and monarchs now shared the throne of fear with the Church, and the punishment of the body became a language that both institutions spoke fluently. In the streets of medieval cities, pain was no longer confined to dungeons. It was brought out into the open, placed on wooden stages, framed by gallows, surrounded by cheering crowds. Torture had evolved from a secret interrogation to a public performance. For the people, it was both fear and fascination. To witness suffering was to witness power, a reminder of divine and royal authority. And for those who ruled, it was a demonstration that law was not just written on parchment, but carved into flesh. The public square became the theater of control. Its audience was not just entertained, they were educated. Every punishment carried a message. This is what happens to those who defy the crown. This is what happens when faith is mocked. Executioners became celebrities of sorts. They were craftsmen of agony, men who understood anatomy better than most physicians. Their work demanded precision. Too much cruelty could inspire sympathy, too little could weaken fear. They walked a fine line between justice and spectacle. In France, Germany, and England, public executions drew thousands. People traveled from villages from miles around to see a traitor flayed, a thief branded, a witch burned. It was not simply curiosity, it was ritual. The people saw themselves reflected in the condemned, and in that reflection they found reassurance that their obedience kept them safe. But behind the cheers and the prayers, there was another truth. Pain had become entertainment. The gallows were not built in secret. They were constructed at the heart of towns, beside marketplaces and cathedrals. Children watched as men screamed. Vendors sold bread and ale while bodies burned. The line between morality and spectacle disappeared, replaced by a collective hunger for control and the thrill of witnessing it enforced. One of the most infamous of these public devices was the breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel. The condemned was tied to a massive wooden wheel laid flat on the ground. The executioner would strike each limb with a heavy iron bar, shattering bones one by one. When the body was broken, the wheel was hoisted upright, displaying the twisted form to the crowd. Some victims lived for hours, even days, their suffering prolonged for the sake of the audience. To modern eyes, it seems unimaginable. But in the medieval mind, the wheel was not only punishment, it was purification. The breaking of the body symbolized the breaking of sin, and the public display reminded all who watched that divine justice had been fulfilled. In England, treason carried an even darker performance: hanging, drawing, and quartering. It began with hanging, but not to death. The victim was cut down while still alive. Then came disembowelment, the removal of organs while the body still writhed. Finally, the remains were divided into quarters, each part displayed in different parts of the kingdom as a warning. This was not justice. It was theater, a brutal, deliberate expression of dominance. For women accused of witchcraft, the spectacle was even more tragic. Their trials were public, their tortures symbolic. Accused of dancing with the devil or whispering curses in the dark, they were subjected to tests designed not to prove guilt, but to confirm it. The swimming test declared that if a woman floated, she was guilty, for water rejected the impure. If she sank and drowned, she was innocent and dead. Crowds gathered to watch these trials. Superstition, fear, and fascination blended into one. A witch's burning was seen as a cleansing of the land, her screams, a hymn of divine justice. In Germany and Central Europe, another device made its infamous debut: the iron chair, lined with hundreds of sharp spikes. It was heated from below with fire. The condemned was strapped to it while officials recited charges and witnesses confirmed their testimony. The victim's flesh seared and bled, yet death came slowly, deliberately delayed until the confession was complete or the lesson sufficiently learned. The symbolism was unmistakable, a throne of agony for those who challenged authority. Even rulers found themselves fascinated by the spectacle they commanded. In France, King Henry III attended executions as a form of ceremony. In England, nobles debated the efficiency of different devices, as though discussing architecture or art. For them, pain was not cruelty, it was governance. The public theater of torture served two purposes: deterrence and devotion. By witnessing punishment, people reaffirmed their loyalty not out of love, but fear. It taught them that obedience was survival, but there was something darker beneath the surface. The crowd's fascination with torture revealed a hidden truth about human nature: that cruelty, when made righteous, becomes irresistible. When an execution ended, the audience returned home not horrified, but satisfied. They spoke of the condemned's sins, of the justice served. Children imitated executioners in their games, and thus, the spectacle became tradition, an accepted part of life. The authorities had succeeded in making violence sacred. Every act of torture was now a sermon, every execution a celebration. Over time, new devices were created to perfect the spectacle. The gibbet, a hanging cage used to display the corpse of a criminal, became a common sight. Bodies were left to rot in the open air, their decay a message more potent than any sermon. The pillory humiliated the guilty, exposing them to mockery and abuse. Even minor crimes were punished publicly, not to harm the body, but to crush dignity. Through these rituals, society learned to associate morality with suffering. A good man feared pain, a wicked man deserved it. It was a logic that could justify anything. As Europe moved closer to the Renaissance, science and philosophy began to challenge the church, yet the culture of punishment persisted. Humanism may have awakened minds, but fear still ruled hearts. Torture continued, justified not by faith, but by law. Kings replaced priests, courts replaced cathedrals, yet the rack, the wheel, and the flame remained. What had once been divine retribution was now statecraft. Justice had simply changed its uniform. And so the theater of pain continued, its audience growing, its meaning evolving. What began as spiritual correction became political enforcement. The body remained the canvas. The message remained the same: control through fear, truth through suffering, order through agony. The age of spectacle had begun, and it would soon give rise to devices more cunning, more merciless, and more symbolic than ever before. The Middle Ages were not only defined by iron and blood, but by innovation in cruelty. Behind monastery walls and castle basements, blacksmiths and inquisitors collaborated, creating instruments that blended mechanical ingenuity with moral corruption. These weren't tools for mere punishment, they were built to extract the soul through pain, to display divine power through human agony. One of the most infamous of these inventions was the Iron Maiden. Despite debates among historians about its actual medieval use, it has become a symbol of the period's macabre imagination, a coffin-like sarcophagus lined with inward-pointing spikes. It was said to embrace its victim with death. The spikes were deliberately positioned not to kill instantly but to pierce vital areas slowly: eyes, shoulders, stomach, ensuring that the victim remained alive long enough to experience suffocating agony. The symbolism was profound. The maiden represented the merciless mother of justice, the church's way of cleansing heretics through blood and faith. Another horror that stalked the dungeons was the rack, perhaps the most recognized of all torture devices. Constructed of wood and iron, its design was brutally simple: two rollers connected by ropes. The victim's wrists were tied to one end, ankles to the other. As the handle turned, joints dislocated, tendons snapped, and muscles tore apart. Every turn of the wheel was a question, every scream an answer. Under the rack's merciless stretch, even the strongest knights confessed to sins they had never committed. The church called it the instrument of truth. In reality, it was the language of fear. But cruelty was not confined to the dungeon's walls. It was often public, a theater of suffering designed to educate through terror. In city squares, crowds gathered to witness pain as if it were entertainment. The breaking wheel, for instance, was one such spectacle. The condemned was tied to a massive cartwheel, their limbs positioned over its spokes. Executioners would then strike with iron hammers, shattering bones one by one. The body was woven into the wheel and displayed high above the city gates, left for crows to feast upon. Death could take days. It wasn't just punishment, it was a message written in flesh: defy authority, and this is your fate. Yet, perhaps the darkest irony of all was how faith and justice intertwined with torture. The church, in its pursuit of purity, justified these horrors as acts of salvation. To confess under torture was to cleanse the soul. To die under its grip was to purge evil. The Inquisition, both in Spain and across Europe, institutionalized these beliefs. Torture chambers became temples of truth, where priests stood beside executioners, reading scripture as bones cracked. The victims, accused heretics, witches, or political dissidents, were told their suffering served God's will, and many believed it, praying through screams, hoping redemption waited beyond death. One particularly cruel device that embodied this fusion of pain and piety was the Judas cradle. Shaped like a pyramid, the victim was lowered onto its pointed tip, naked, vulnerable, and bound. The torturer controlled how deep the descent went. Days could pass before death came from infection or internal bleeding. It was said that the device lifted sin from the body, as the victim's weight forced the sharp wooden spike deeper into the flesh. The act was silent, methodical, and ritualistic, Asterisk, not far behind in infamy was the pear of anguish, a metal pear-shaped object inserted into the mouth, vagina or rectum. Once inside, it was expanded using a screw mechanism, tearing internal tissues apart, designed to punish liars, blasphemers, or women accused of witchcraft. It symbolized the punishment of the tongue that lied, the body that sinned, and the soul that defied. Asterisk, these devices were not created in isolation. They were part of a culture obsessed with confession, purity, and dominance. Monarchs used them to crush rebellion. Inquisitors used them to silence heresy. Torture was not just a method of pain, it was a system of control. By inflicting terror, rulers maintained order. By displaying agony, they preserved power. Asterisk, even as Europe entered the Renaissance, an era supposedly of enlightenment, the shadows of these devices lingered. Torture evolved with technology. Iron became more refined. Gears and screws replaced crude ropes and levers. Devices like the scavenger's daughter, which compressed the body rather than stretching it, emerged as humane alternatives. But the essence remained the same: to break the human spirit while maintaining the illusion of justice. Asterisk, what made these devices truly horrifying wasn't just their construction, it was their purpose. They were built to extract not information, but obedience. To teach entire populations that questioning faith or authority meant annihilation. Torture wasn't just inflicted on individuals, it was performed for societies. Asterisk, by the dawn of the 17th century, the world began to question these methods. Philosophers and jurists debated morality and truth. Some called torture unreliable, arguing that anyone would confess under pain. Others insisted it was necessary, that fear was the foundation of order. But even as the debates raged, the instruments remained, hidden beneath castles and courts, relics of a world that believed suffering was divine. Asterisk. The story of ancient torture devices isn't just about iron and blood, it's about the dark side of human nature, the need to dominate, to control, to define truth through terror. These devices were not just products of cruelty, but reflections of the age's beliefs that pain could reveal purity, that fear could uphold faith. Asterisk, as centuries passed, many of these instruments were destroyed or buried, yet their memory persists in museums, in historical records, and in the collective psyche of humanity. They remind us that beneath every civilization's light lies a shadow, a place where the line between justice and cruelty disappears. Among the many instruments of agony that haunted medieval Europe, none symbolized the ingenuity of cruelty more than the brazen bull, an invention so diabolical that it blurred the line between justice and sadism. Originating not in the Middle Ages but in ancient Greece, it became a legend retold in later centuries as the perfect metaphor for tyranny. The brazen bull was the creation of Perillos of Athens, a craftsman who presented it to the tyrant Phalaris of Agrigentum around 560 BCE, cast entirely in bronze and shaped like a life-size bull. The device had a complex system of pipes and valves inside its head. When a victim was placed within and the fire lit beneath, the metal grew scorching hot, roasting the person alive. But the horror didn't end there. The design of the pipes transformed the victim's screams into what sounded like the bellowing of a bull. It was a symphony of death engineered for spectacle. Phalaris, it said, was so delighted by the invention that he decided to test it on its own creator. Perillos was thrown into his own device, and his screams were the first to echo through its bronze throat. Though this story predates the Dark Ages, its essence traveled through centuries, shaping the imagination of later torturers. The bull became the symbol of rulers who believed fear was the purest form of governance. By the medieval era, similar principles of fire and enclosure evolved into new tools. The heated iron chair, for example, found in Inquisition records, made of metal with spikes covering its seats, arms, and backrest. The victim was strapped naked upon it while a fire burned underneath. Within minutes, the body blistered, skin fused to the iron, and pain became indescribable. These chairs were not hidden in darkness. Some were placed in public courts so others could watch the spectacle of punishment and learn obedience. If the brazen bull represented the art of transforming screams into music, the rack represented the art of silence, the slow unraveling of the human body until only whispers remained. Its operation was precise. The executioner would ask a question, turn the wheel, and wait. The joints popped, ligaments tore. When the victim fainted, cold water revived them and the questions resumed. Many confessions written in medieval records were signed with trembling hands that could barely hold a quill, their signatures crooked remnants of shattered bodies. Yet, some of the darkest tools of the age weren't mechanical marvels but psychological weapons. The heretic's fork, for example, was a simple device, a metal rod with two sharp prongs at each end. One prong pressed under the chin, the other against the sternum. A strap fixed it around the neck, preventing the victim from sleeping or lowering their head. If they dozed off, the prongs pierced their flesh. It was often used in religious punishment to keep heretics awake in repentance, forcing them to remain conscious of their sin. Then came the Spanish donkey, a device so deceptively simple that its brutality is often underestimated. The victim was made to sit astride a sharp, triangular wooden beam like sitting on a blade. Weights were tied to their legs, increasing pressure until the body split along the pelvis. Used widely during the Spanish Inquisition, it was said to purify the soul by dividing the sinner's body. To the inquisitors, suffering was sacred. To the victims, it was unending hell. The Church often masked such cruelty in theology. Pain, they claimed, was the gateway to redemption. Torture was divine justice on earth, a purification before death. Better to suffer in flesh than in soul, they said. It was this ideology that justified centuries of unspeakable torment. The Catherine wheel, or breaking wheel, pushed this ideology to its peak. Once a symbol of martyrdom named after St. Catherine of Alexandria, who was supposedly tortured on such a wheel, it became a tool for execution. The condemned was tied to the spokes, and the executioner shattered each limb with a hammer. The broken body was then woven through the wheel's rim and hoisted high, left to die slowly. Birds feasted on the flesh while the public looked on. It was a message carved into the sky that defiance was not just punished, but displayed. But not all victims were rebels or heretics. Many were women accused of witchcraft, and their suffering took on a special form of horror. The witch's chair, for instance, was similar to the iron chair but combined humiliation with pain. The accused would be stripped, bound, and seated upon spikes for hours during interrogation. Others faced the ducking stool, a punishment meant for scolds or women accused of witchcraft, where they were repeatedly submerged in freezing water. Survival was seen as proof of witchcraft. Drowning was taken as innocence. Either way, death was near. In Germany and parts of Eastern Europe, women were subjected to the breastripper, an instrument of iron claws used to mutilate female victims accused of adultery or heresy. The brutality of these acts reveals more than hatred, it reveals control. Torture was not only a tool of justice, it was a way to define power over gender, belief, and identity. And then there was the Judas cradle, one of the most psychologically terrifying devices ever conceived. Victims were stripped, bound, and suspended above a pyramid-shaped seat. Slowly, ropes were loosened, and gravity did the rest. The tip pierced the body, and every movement deepened the wound. Some victims were kept alive for days. Torturers claimed it was designed to open the sinner's body so the truth may escape. And in truth, it was designed to destroy both flesh and dignity. The church inquisitions were systematic, but secular rulers were no less creative. In Italy and France, criminals faced a chair with a metal collar that tightened around the neck using a screw. A final twist crushed the spine or strung-lied the victim. In England, the scavenger's daughter compacted the body into an excruciating fold, head to knees, arms, 2 legs, until blood gushed from the nose and ears. Every region had its own interpretation of pain, yet all shared one philosophy: torture was truth. The logic was circular and cruel. The innocent had nothing to fear, so confession under pain only proved guilt. Even as the Enlightenment began to dawn, the machinery of torment didn't vanish overnight. It hid itself within prisons, behind laws, and under new names. Devices evolved into tools of psychological coercion. Public executions turned into secret interrogations. The instruments changed, but the purpose remained. Pain was still the instrument of control. By the dawn of the Renaissance, Europe was awakening from its medieval slumber, a time when knowledge began to bloom, when art and reason started to challenge faith and superstition. Yet beneath the marble statues and the frescoed ceilings, the shadow of torture did not fade. It only evolved. The language of cruelty changed. What had once been openly brutal became systematic, procedural, and bureaucratic. The church and crown no longer called it punishment. They called it interrogation by question. Extraordinarily, torture, once performed in open squares, was now carried out in chambers behind locked doors, sanctioned by law and justified by science. The shift was chilling. Where medieval torturers had relied on fear and faith, their Renaissance successors cloaked their cruelty in reason and legitimacy. The Inquisition's manuals, written in Latin and distributed across Europe, outlined precise methods: how long a suspect could be tortured before confession was invalid, how pain could be measured without permanent injury, and how to ensure the condemned did not die before truth was extracted. It was a new age, not of mercy, but of efficiency. During the witch hunts of the 15th and 16th centuries, this methodical approach reached its peak. The church, still obsessed with rooting out heresy, turned its attention to witches, mostly women, accused of sleeping with demons, cursing crops, or dancing with the devil. In towns across Germany, France, and Scotland, thousands were rounded up and questioned. And when words failed, the tools of truth were brought forth. The thumbscrew became a common implement, a small device of 2 iron plates with tightening screws. It crushed the fingers or thumbs slowly, splintering bone and tearing nails. It was small enough to carry in a satchel, portable enough for traveling inquisitors. A single twist could turn courage into confession. Another favored method was the boot, also called the Spanish boot. This device encased the victim's legs in iron or wood. Then wedges were hammered between the planks until bone splintered. The sound of cracking shins became the rhythm of justice. Even physicians, men of science, were sometimes present, ensuring the victim did not die too quickly. Torture had become a profession. But even as science advanced, superstition thrived. The belief that witches could not feel pain led to further horrors. Accused women were pricked with needles to find the devil-esque mark, an insensitive spot supposedly proof of their pact with Satan. If no mark was found, new tortures followed until one was discovered. These investigations were less about proof and more about belief, less about justice and more about fear. The witch hunts weren't merely acts of cruelty, they were acts of mass hysteria, state-sanctioned paranoia. Torture fueled it. Each confession, extracted under agony, led to more accusations, more arrests, more burnings. Towns became engines of fear, consuming themselves. By the time the madness waned, tens of thousands were dead, their bodies burned, their screams forgotten, their names erased. The Renaissance also saw a refinement of public executions, transforming them from crude punishments into orchestrated performances. In Paris, Rome, and London, crowds gathered not just to see death, but to witness justice in motion. In England, the hanging, drawing, and quartering of traitors became a royal spectacle. The condemned were hanged until near death, then cut down and disemboweled. Their intestines were burned before their eyes. Finally, their bodies were quartered limbs displayed across the kingdom. Each act carried symbolism. The hanging punished the crime. The disembowelment purified the soul. The quartering erased the memory. France perfected its own brand of terror with the wheel and fire, while Spain used the garrote as a supposedly humane alternative, a steel collar that crushed the neck swiftly. But swift was relative. Many strangled slowly, gasping for minutes while priests whispered absolution. The age of exploration and empire didn't end the era of pain, it exported it. The same instruments used in Europe were carried to colonies across the world. In South America, Africa, and Asia, they became tools of domination. The cross and the sword walked hand in hand, and with them came the whip, the chain, and the branding iron. Torture became global, a mark of civilization's hypocrisy. By the 17th century, philosophers like Cesare Beccaria and Voltaire began to question these horrors. They argued that torture produced not truth, but lies born of agony. The innocent will confess anything, wrote Beccaria, and the guilty will remain silent through stubbornness. But their words clashed with centuries of dogma. Kings and inquisitors believed that order required fear, and fear required pain. Still, cracks began to form. Slowly, the image of justice began to shift from vengeance to reform. Executions became less theatrical, torture less visible. The instruments were hidden away, locked in archives and vaults, sometimes melted down, sometimes forgotten. Yet the idea of torture, the belief that pain could reveal truth, remained embedded in human psychology. The Dark Ages had ended, but their shadows stretched far beyond the Renaissance. In prisons, in wars, and in interrogation chambers, that same old logic survived. Pain compels obedience, fear maintains control. History would later call this progress, but in truth, it was only evolution from iron to ideology. By the time the Enlightenment dawned in Europe, the world was speaking the language of philosophy, liberty, and reason. The printing press had multiplied ideas faster than any inquisition could burn them. Men like John Locke, Voltaire, and Montesquieu argued that justice should be based on logic, not vengeance. The church's grip on truth began to loosen, and the power of the monarchies began to fade. On the surface, it looked as if the age of torture was finally dying. But the truth was far darker. Torture did not disappear, it changed its mask. The Enlightenment, for all its talk of human dignity, was also an era of experimentation. While philosophers denounced the cruelty of the rack and the wheel, governments quietly searched for subtler ways to extract obedience. Pain was no longer celebrated publicly, it was administered scientifically, behind locked doors. In the name of progress and order, the 18th century introduced the notion of humane punishment. Yet the irony was bitter. Devices were refined to cause maximum agony with minimal spectacle. Public mutilation gave way to the guillotine, hailed by its inventor, Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine, as a rational and painless method of execution. Equality in death, he called it. It was quick, efficient, bloodless in theory, a symbol of modern justice. But to those who watched heads tumble into baskets during the French Revolution, it was just another theater of horror. The difference was only in presentation, not morality. Meanwhile, European powers expanded across continents, taking their methods with them. In colonies from India to the Caribbean, the same logic of domination resurfaced. Torture became part of the colonial machinery used to suppress uprisings, extract confessions, and enforce fear among native populations. The lash, the stock, and the branding iron were instruments of empire, and though they no longer carried the name of religion, they served the same purpose, control through suffering. As Europe industrialized, torture entered the age of bureaucracy. The Enlightenment's obsession with categorization and order extended even into punishment. Prisons replaced dungeons, and with them came new philosophies of discipline. Instead of tearing bodies apart, the system sought to reshape minds. The French philosopher Michel Foucault, centuries later, would call this the shift from the body of pain to the soul of guilt. The instruments changed, but the essence of control endured. Solitary confinement replaced the rack. Silence replaced the scream. The goal was no longer to make the body confess, but to make the mind submit. In the 19th century, torture was officially outlawed in much of Europe. Yet even as governments declared their morality, their armies and secret police continued to practice the art of pain in secret. Under empires and revolutions alike, interrogation became the euphemism of choice. The words had changed, but the meaning was the same. During the Napoleonic Wars, prisoners were beaten, starved, and left to rot. In colonial prisons across Africa and Asia, local resistors were whipped until they renounced rebellion. In the United States, slavery institutionalized torture. The whip, the iron collar, and the shackle became symbols of economic power. Pain had become a tool of production. By the 20th century, technology transformed torture into an industry of precision. Electricity replaced fire, chemicals replaced iron. Nations that prided themselves on enlightenment built labor camps and interrogation cells that rivaled the darkest dungeons of medieval times. The Spanish Inquisition's purity through pain became the Nazi regime's purity through extermination. The ideology had evolved, but the cruelty was identical. In the Soviet Union, Stalin's secret police used psychological torture, sleep deprivation, isolation, and constant fear to crush dissent. They didn't need racks or wheels. The human mind, they discovered, was its own instrument of destruction. Prisoners confessed to impossible crimes, not because their bodies broke, but because their reality was dismantled. During World War II, the Japanese Kempeitai, the German Gestapo, and countless other regimes perfected torture as an administrative procedure. Interrogation manuals detailed step-by-step techniques for inducing compliance without killing the subject. Pain became standardized, measurable, and repeatable, a science. Even after the war, as nations signed the Geneva Conventions and declared torture illegal, it continued to thrive in shadows. In Latin America during the Cold War, US-backed regimes used electric shocks, drowning, and beatings to suppress dissent, always under the label of national security. In the East, communist states mirrored these methods, calling them re-education. Across the globe, the medieval belief persisted: pain reveals truth, fear ensures order. By the late 20th century, technology gave birth to new instruments, not of metal but of psychology. Sensory deprivation tanks, stress positions, mock executions, and white torture. The use of total sensory isolation became the tools of the modern age. There was no blood, no broken bone, but the victims emerged hollow, their sense of time, self and identity erased. In a sense, the Enlightenment had achieved its goal. Pain was now civilized, no longer a spectacle for the crowd. It became a secret transaction between the state and the victim, carried out in rooms without witnesses, documented in reports, and justified with paperwork. And yet, the philosophy remained unchanged from the dungeons of the Dark Ages. To break resistance, to silence truth, to preserve power. Humanity had learned to speak of liberty while whispering its tortures in the dark. The horror of the Judas cradle lay not just in its design, but in its philosophy. It transformed morality into mutilation. The pair of anguish, the voice of silence in the age of confession. Silence was treason. To silence the accused permanently, the pair of anguish was created. A metal device shaped like a closed flower. It could be inserted into the mouth, the rectum, or the vagina. Once inside, a screw mechanism expanded its petals outward, tearing tissue apart. It was used against liars, blasphemers, and women accused of witchcraft. Its cruelty lay in its precision: no blood spilled publicly, no scars visible. The victims' screams were muffled, their shame hidden. It was a punishment meant to erase both body and voice. Some versions were engraved with demonic faces, as if to remind the condemned of the devil they were accused of serving. The wheel breaking the body, displaying the order while many devices were confined to dungeons. The breaking wheel belonged to the public square. A heavy cartwheel, reinforced with iron, used to transform execution into spectacle. The condemned was tied across its spokes. The executioner, armed with an iron club, struck between the bones, careful not to kill too quickly. When the body was shattered, the wheel was raised upright and displayed, the broken limbs dangling like ribbons. The agony was prolonged intentionally. Sometimes the victim's chest was spared until the end, ensuring that he remained conscious to witness his own ruin. The wheel became an emblem of divine order. It taught that every rebellion would end in pieces, every sin displayed before the world. The breast ripper, the punishment of the unholy woman in a society ruled by faith. Female disobedience was often treated as witchcraft or lust. To punish it, a tool known as the breast ripper or iron spider was invented. For sharp claws attached to a handle were heated red hot. They were then driven into the woman's chest and torn outward, ripping flesh from bone. This was not justice. It was humiliation made sacred, a warning to other women that their bodies were not their own. They belonged to the moral order defined by men and priests. The scavenger's daughter, the reverse of the rack. Where the rack stretched the body, the scavenger's daughter compressed it. Invented in Tudor England, it was a metal frame that forced the victim into a crouched position. The head was pushed down, knees pulled up, arms bound tight. As pressure increased, blood burst from the nose and ears, internal organs crushed under their own strain. It was compact, efficient, and silent, the perfect device for a bureaucratic age of torture. The Spanish donkey, the splitting of the self, a long wooden plank shaped like a sharp triangle, balanced on a beam. The condemned was forced to sit astride it, naked, while weights were tied to their legs. The more they struggled, the deeper the blade cut between them. It was slow, humiliating, and designed to make the victim destroy themselves. The Spanish donkey was used widely in Europe's later inquisitions, often in public, often with laughter from onlookers. It represented the perfect fusion of control, shame, and endurance, a punishment that relied on the victim's own will to survive. By the end of the 15th century, torture had become a refined art. It was no longer about chaos or vengeance, it was administration. Devices were standardized, protocols written, and executioners trained. Pain had been perfected. The most chilling truth of this era was not the cruelty of the devices themselves, it was the conviction with which they were used. The men who turned the wheels and tightened the screws believed they were serving justice. The screams they heard were not evidence of suffering, but of sin leaving the body. Civilization had reached a point where intelligence and ingenuity were devoted entirely to destruction. And yet, the story of torture did not end here. As the world moved toward enlightenment, reason replaced religion, but power found new ways to preserve fear. The dungeons would not disappear, they would evolve. The invention of pain devices that defined the Dark Ages when the art of public punishment reached its height. Europe entered an era obsessed with engineering pain. Torture was no longer the spontaneous cruelty of a tyrant, it became a science. Every screw, every spike, every turn of iron had a purpose. Each was designed not only to destroy the body but to bend the mind. This was the age when blacksmiths and craftsmen worked not for kings or merchants, but for inquisitors and executioners. Their forges glowed red with divine approval, their tools baptized in screams. The line between invention and evil blurred until they became indistinguishable. The dungeons of this period were laboratories of human suffering, windowless rooms buried beneath castles, cathedrals, and courthouses. Here invention thrived in darkness. The rack, the machine of truth among all devices, none symbolized the precision of medieval torture more than the rack. Its design was simple, a rectangular wooden frame, large enough to hold a human body. At each end, rollers connected by ropes and cranks waited to be turned. The prisoner was bound hand and foot, and with every rotation the ropes pulled tighter. At first, the tension stretched muscles, then ligaments snapped, joints popped from their sockets, and the sound, that sharp tearing of sinew, echoed like music to the torturer's trained ear. It was said that a skilled executioner could control the process with such delicacy that a man could be stretched for hours, screaming yet alive, every bone intact but every nerve burning. Those who confessed were released, broken and trembling, proof that truth had been found. Those who didn't were left disfigured, their limbs elongated beyond recognition. The rack was not meant to kill. Death was mercy, confession was victory. Its design spread across Europe from the Tower of London to the prisons of Spain. In each place it acquired new names: the Duke of Exeter's daughter, the Question, the Horse, but its message was universal. Truth has a price and it is measured in agony. The Iron Maiden, the Virgin of Pain. If the rack represented precision, the Iron Maiden embodied symbolism. It appeared as a tall, upright sarcophagus of iron, shaped like a woman. The front panel swung open on hinges, revealing rows of inward-pointing spikes. The victim was placed inside, and the door closed slowly, each spike piercing flesh, but carefully avoiding vital organs. Death came not from a single wound but from hundreds of shallow ones, bleeding the body slowly. The Iron Maiden's face was often sculpted into that of the Virgin Mary, a grotesque parody of mercy. It was not merely a device, it was a sermon cast in metal. To be embraced by the maiden was to be embraced by divine judgment. Though historians debate whether early versions truly existed in the Middle Ages or were later reconstructions, the idea of the Iron Maiden captures the essence of the age perfectly. Faith fused with terror, compassion perverted into cruelty. The Judas cradle. The pyramid of shame. Among the most psychologically devastating instruments was the Judas cradle, known for its merciless intimacy. A tall wooden pyramid, its tip sharpened to a point. The victim, stripped bare, was suspended by ropes and lowered slowly onto the tip, which entered the body through the most sensitive regions. Weight was applied gradually, and sometimes oil was used to prolong suffering. The goal was not immediate death, but humiliation and degradation. The body tore itself apart over hours or even days, the victim's own weight becoming the executioner. The cradle was used primarily against those accused of sexual deviance, witchcraft or blasphemy, crimes seen as defilements of purity. By impaling the body in this obscene way, the act was meant to restore moral order through pain. Torture in the Dark Ages had transcended the physical. By now, fear itself was a weapon, meticulously engineered to dominate minds. It was no longer enough to break bones. The goal was to reshape thought, obedience, and identity. In chambers hidden beneath monastery walls and castle basements, victims were stripped not only of clothing, but of dignity and certainty. Silence became an instrument, the anticipation of pain a hammer on the psyche. Isolation was one of the most effective tools. Victims were placed in dark cells for weeks or months. Deprived of light, human contact, and sleep, they began to lose track of time and reality. In some dungeons, prisoners were shackled alone in narrow spaces so small that movement was impossible. Their bodies cramped, limbs atrophied, minds wandered into hallucination. Fear became omnipresent. The self dissolved. Those who had once resisted authority eventually begged for mercy, confessing sins they had never committed. Humiliation was another layer of control. Prisoners were stripped naked, paraded in cages, or forced to perform degrading acts. These rituals were often public, not to punish the body, but to terrorize the collective psyche of the populace. Citizens, watching from balconies and squares, internalized the lesson: power demanded obedience, and disobedience meant total annihilation. The architecture of torture, in this sense, extended beyond walls. Fear became a social currency. Some of the most ingenious devices combined physical agony with psychological torment. The heretic's fork, a simple iron rod with 2 spikes pressing under the chin and against the chest, forced the prisoner to maintain a constant posture. Sleep was impossible. Even the slightest nod would impale flesh. This unyielding discomfort crushed resolve. Similarly, the scavenger's daughter compressed bodies into unnatural folds, suffocating limbs while leaving the mind fully aware of every twitch, every strain. It was the meticulous orchestration of despair. Even interrogation rituals reinforced the psychological hierarchy of power. Torturers often spoke in calm monotones, asking questions over hours and days while the victim endured slow, unbearable pain. Confessions were never taken at face value. They were crafted under duress. Yet for the authorians, the purpose was not merely to extract truth. It was to demonstrate absolute dominance over the human will. Knowledge, fear, and obedience intertwined. The mind itself became a battlefield, and those who resisted too long were often deemed damned, regardless of innocence. Religious ideology lent justification to these horrors. Pain was framed as divine purification. Confession under torture was considered a sacrament. Inquisitors preached that suffering cleansed the soul, yet the reality was far grimmer. It was control disguised as morality. Saints and martyrs became symbols, yet countless innocents endured unending torment. Their suffering rationalized in the name of salvation. Torture was also a political instrument. Monarchs, rulers, and magistrates used it to silence dissent and maintain authority. Public displays of punishment were carefully choreographed to instill fear without seeming tyrannical. Each broken body, each shattered limb, reinforced the hierarchy, a tangible reminder that the state could dominate not only flesh, but thought. Authority became synonymous with pain, obedience inseparable from terror. Even when devices were hidden away, the psychological legacy persisted. The threat alone was enough to bend communities to will. Rumors of secret chambers, whispers of past atrocities, and legends of instruments like the Iron Maiden and the rack haunted the populace. People internalized fear, regulating their own behavior to avoid the unseen hand of justice. Torture was no longer merely an act. It was a pervasive atmosphere, an omnipresent force shaping entire societies. This chapter of human cruelty demonstrated that true power did not rely solely on execution or spectacle. It relied on the suspension of hope, the distortion of reality, and the manipulation of perception. Minds broken in isolation or fear were often more controllable than bodies bound in chains. Psychological mastery had become the pinnacle of tyranny. Yet, within this darkness, flickers of resistance appeared. Some victims, even under unbearable torment, refused to confess or obey. Their defiance, though often ending in death, challenged the assumption that power could dominate every mind. History records these moments sparingly, brief flashes where human will resisted institutionalized cruelty. They were rare, but they proved that even in the darkest dungeons, the human spirit could endure. In these rooms of agony, silence was often more terrifying than screams. One of the most disturbing psychological devices was the coffin torture, an iron cage shaped like the human body. Sometimes large, sometimes painfully small. The condemned was placed inside the cage, sealed, and hung in the town square. There, birds would pick at their flesh as the sun baked them alive. There was no blade, no spike, only time. Time and humiliation. Passers-by saw the dying body swinging in the air, and the message was clear. This is what happens to those who defy power. The fear of public disgrace often broke people long before their bodies did. In the dungeons of Nuremberg, another nightmare waited: the chair of torture. A simple chair, but forged in iron, covered in hundreds of spikes. When a victim sat, the spikes tore into flesh. The torturer would then tighten straps, forcing the person deeper into the chair. Beneath the seat, small fires were lit, heating the iron until it burned through the body. It wasn't death that terrified, it was the waiting. The slow realization that every breath would only bring more pain. But perhaps the cruelest invention of all was the brazen bull, designed in ancient Greece but refined by medieval executioners. A hollow bronze statue shaped like a bull, with a door in its side. The condemned was locked inside, and a fire was set beneath. As the metal heated, the victim roasted alive, and the screams, traveling through pipes and vents, emerged as the bellowing of a bull. It was torture turned into performance, pain turned into art. The horror didn't end there. Deep in the catacombs beneath castles, inquisitors developed devices meant not just to kill, but to destroy the will. The Judas cradle, a pyramid-shaped seat where victims were lowered onto its sharp tip, impaling them slowly. The body's own weight decided how deep the wound would go. It could last hours or days. Torturers ensured that no organ was pierced too soon. Death had to wait. Another feared mechanism was the rack, perhaps the most iconic of medieval cruelty. Victims were tied at both ends, wrists and ankles, and their bodies stretched by turning a wheel. Bones cracked, ligaments tore, and joints popped out of sockets. But the goal wasn't to kill, it was to make the victim speak. Confession, that was the prize. Under unbearable pain, even the innocent confessed. The church and monarchs used such devices to extract not truth, but obedience. Then came the iron boot, used across Europe. A prisoner's leg was placed inside a metal casing, and wedges were hammered between the boot and flesh until the bones shattered. The sound of splintering bones became a warning that echoed through stone walls. Inquisitors were not merely sadists, they were architects of fear. They designed pain scientifically. The head crusher was a perfect example. The victim's jaw rested on a metal plate, with a cap pressing down on the skull. Turning the screw slowly, the torturer crushed the jaw, eyes, and skull in perfect rhythm. Blood and teeth spilled out, yet death came only at the very end. It was not meant to kill quickly, it was meant to show control. Among nobles and heretics, the Iron Maiden became infamous, though historians debate its exact origin. It was a coffin-like cabinet lined with spikes inside. Once the victim stepped in, the doors closed, piercing flesh but missing vital organs. The condemned bled slowly, sometimes for days. Some believe it was used more as a symbol, a warning to enemies of the state, than as an actual instrument. The psychological effect of these machines was immense. The people of that time grew up believing that hell existed, not after death, but here, in the dungeons beneath the church or castle. Fear was the true weapon. Executions often took place in open squares where children, priests and merchants watched. The crowd wasn't forced to come, they came willingly. Pain became spectacle, a lesson. When the torturer raised his hand, silence fell over the square. One strike, one scream, and hundreds of hearts trembled. The rulers knew, fear unified people better than faith. The torture chambers were not hidden secrets. They were reminders carved in wood, hammered in iron of what defiance cost. Across France, Germany, Spain, and England, kings and inquisitors perfected this dark science. The Inquisition, in particular, transformed torture into ritual. It was not about sadism, it was about purification. Pain was seen as divine, the cleansing of the soul through suffering. But even the torturers were haunted. Some went mad after years of hearing screams in the dark. Chronicles tell of executioners who refused to sleep in silence because they said they could still hear the voices of those they broke. The tools of torture were not just physical inventions, they were reflections of the human psyche. The Iron Maiden, the rack, the wheel, the chair, all born from one seed, the human capacity to dominate another. And yet in these acts of cruelty, another truth emerged, one that history tried to bury. The victims, despite unimaginable pain, sometimes refused to break. Some died without confession, staring into the eyes of their torturers with quiet defiance. In that silence, a strange victory was born. It is easy to look back and call the Dark Ages barbaric. But what if the same psychology still exists today, not in iron and fire, but in power, manipulation, and control? The methods may have changed, but the intention remains: to break the will, to dominate the mind. The devices of ancient torture were not just tools of death, they were mirrors. They showed what humans become when morality is replaced by fear. When the fires died and the screams faded, the dungeon stood silent. The age of fear that had gripped Europe for centuries began to crumble under the light of reason. The Enlightenment did more than question monarchy and church dogma. It challenged the very foundation of torture itself. Philosophers, writers, and reformers argued that cruelty could never yield truth, that pain was a poor substitute for justice. The idea that humans might be rational, moral beings capable of reason began to undermine the centuries-old logic of fear. Prisons that once echoed with the screams of the condemned were redesigned. Torture chambers fell silent, and public executions became rarer, replaced by swift sentences and regulated incarceration. Instruments of agony, once proudly displayed in town squares, were removed from sight, melted, broken, or locked away in archives. The rack, the Iron Maiden, and the Brazen Bull survived only in illustrations and manuscripts, haunting the pages of history. In France, the decline of torture was hastened by a combination of intellectual pressure and political necessity. The judicial system, influenced by thinkers like Cesare Beccaria, declared that confessions extracted under pain were unreliable and morally indefensible. The innocent will admit guilt rather than endure agony, Beccaria wrote, and the guilty will feign innocence until death. Courts slowly reformed their procedures, limiting the use of physical coercion and emphasizing evidence and testimony over confession. The Spanish Inquisition, once the epitome of cruelty, began to lose its grip. Monarchs, concerned with international perception and internal unrest, curtailed public executions. Torture, while not immediately abolished, was applied less frequently and more systematically. By the late 18th century, the shadow of the Inquisition had shrunk to a bureaucratic skeleton, its once ominous power largely symbolic. Elsewhere in Europe, Enlightenment ideals spread like wildfire. Prisons in England and Germany experimented with more humane methods of confinement. Penal reformers introduced structured routines, labor, and education in place of brutality. The philosophy was simple. Fear could no longer be the primary instrument of control. Punishment must aim for reform rather than annihilation. Yet the fall of public torture did not erase its legacy. The psychological techniques refined over centuries survived in subtler forms. Isolation, sleep deprivation, intimidation, and surveillance continued to be tools of authority now justified under law rather than divine mandate. Governments and rulers realized that the mind could be as powerful a tool of control as any rack or iron spike. The Enlightenment also ignited debates on morality, human rights, and the value of life. Thinkers like Voltaire, Diderot, and Locke influenced legal systems to codify protections against arbitrary punishment. The idea that every human being possessed inalienable rights began to take hold. By the early 19th century, most European nations had either officially abolished torture or severely restricted its use. In practice, however, the transition was uneven. In remote provinces, secret chambers continued to operate. In colonies across the globe, imperial powers still used torture as a method of control. Instruments may have been hidden, but the principles of fear, obedience, and psychological dominance persisted. The shift was gradual. The end of one era did not instantly erase centuries of brutality. Yet for the first time in history, reformers began to imagine a world without pain as punishment, a world where law and reason could replace cruelty. This marked the true fall of the Inquisition, not just as an institution, but as a philosophy. Torture was no longer celebrated, justified, or glorified. It became a relic, a warning etched in the collective memory of humanity. And so, the chapter closes with a paradox. While instruments of agony were gradually silenced, the lessons they left behind remained potent. Fear and power, cruelty and control, had been intertwined for centuries, and even as Europe embraced justice, the shadow of ancient torment lingered. The fall of the Inquisition was not a triumph over human cruelty, but a transformation from the spectacular public horrors of dungeons and squares to the subtler, hidden mechanisms of control that would shape modern states. Even as centuries passed and the public horrors of torture faded into history, its legacy persisted, adapting to the new structures of power. The instruments of the past, racks, Iron Maidens, Brazen Bulls, may have rusted or been melted down, but the principles that guided them survived, controlled through fear, submission through suffering, and obedience through intimidation. Torture had evolved from a physical spectacle into a psychological architecture embedded in society, law, and politics. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as nation-states consolidated, torture became institutionalized. Prisons and police forces replaced inquisitors and medieval courts. But the methods were refined, not eradicated. Confinement became more systematic, interrogations more sophisticated, and pain more controlled. The goal shifted, no longer public spectacle, no longer about breaking bones to display divine authority. Now it was about extracting compliance, enforcing ideology, and maintaining social order. One chilling example emerged in the early 20th century. During the height of totalitarian regimes, states discovered that fear could be weaponized without even touching the body. Psychological torture became standard. Sleep deprivation, isolation, constant surveillance, and humiliation were used to manipulate, destabilize, and destroy the human mind. Victims were made to doubt reality itself. The effectiveness of these methods lay not in visible injury but in mental collapse. In Nazi Germany, the Gestapo and SS perfected a system that combined physical and psychological agony. Prisoners in concentration camps endured long-term imprisonment, forced labor, and unpredictable violence. Fear itself became a tool. The uncertainty of when or if punishment would occur ensured compliance. The body could survive, but the spirit was relentlessly assaulted. This was the culmination of centuries of evolution. Medieval cruelty translated into bureaucratic, industrialized terror. Across the Atlantic, similar patterns emerged in the Americas. During periods of slavery, colonization, and political repression, torture, whether physical or psychological, maintained power over populations. Enslaved people were broken with whips, chains, and public executions. Indigenous populations under colonial rule faced imprisonment, starvation, and ritual humiliation. Even after legal abolition of such practices, the memory and fear persisted, shaping societal hierarchies and reinforcing obedience. The Cold War era introduced modernized torture techniques, often justified under national security. Governments trained interrogators to use sensory deprivation, stress positions, and mock executions. Manuals were produced detailing how to break down the human psyche while avoiding visible marks, a clinical, detached methodology that mirrored medieval ingenuity but was refined by science. Fear remained the currency of power, only now delivered with precision. The digital age has not ended the legacy of torture, it has transformed it. Surveillance, mass data collection, psychological manipulation through media, and cyber intimidation echo the principles of medieval fear: control without direct confrontation, domination through uncertainty, obedience through subtle omnipresent threat. The human mind, as it was centuries ago, remains a battlefield. The instruments have changed, but the strategy is timeless. Even as societies legislate against torture, the philosophical echoes of the Dark Ages persist. Punishment, compliance, and domination continue to shape institutions, from prisons to military interrogation, from political repression to corporate control. Human cruelty has been refined, hidden, and normalized, yet it remains deeply rooted in history. And yet there is hope. Knowledge, transparency, and human rights advocacy have exposed the mechanisms that once operated in secret. By studying the past, the racks, the Iron Maidens, the public squares, and the dungeons, humanity has the opportunity to recognize patterns, to resist the temptation of fear as a tool, and to design systems where justice, not pain, governs society. The legacy of pain is thus twofold: a warning and a lesson. It shows the extremes to which power can reach when morality is suspended. It also offers insight. By understanding the architecture of fear, societies can build frameworks that protect the mind, preserve dignity, and value truth over domination. History remembers the victims, the anonymous, the oppressed, the innocent. Their endurance, their courage, and sometimes their defiance are the final testament that even in the darkest corridors of human cruelty, the human spirit persists. From the medieval dungeons to modern interrogation rooms, from public squares to invisible psychological pressure, the story of torture is also the story of humanity's struggle with power, morality, and conscience. It is a story not only of pain but of resilience, warning us that while the tools may evolve, the responsibility to resist cruelty is eternal.